And just as a reminder, I don't know if I've said this yet. If you are on Zoom land, please make sure you put your name in the chat so I can make sure I give you credit for attendance today. All right. So our one of our kind of first open topics is culture and development. And last week we reviewed on Thursday kind of the definitions of culture and differentiate the different types of cultures and societies and race and all of those kind of things so that we kind of went into this conversation kind of with some solid definitions. Development, the study of human development is basically how we change psychologically, social, and biologically over time. Okay. Obviously, anyways, I hope we're not the same person today as we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And that's kind of the idea about where are we in all of those domains based on our time we've lived here on this earth, depending on how you view time. Okay. The difficult part about studying human development, especially from a scientific perspective, is that it has focused on what's called Eurocentric development. Okay. About how people should develop based upon populations within what are called weird societies. Okay. Weird means that most of the research in human development has been done in Western educated, industrial, rich, and democratic societies. Okay. And so and the difficult part about this and having these kind of conversations is so the tools we use to measure development were set in a culturally bound situation. They were based upon basically weird societies. And those tools then were used as a comparison to other cultures instead of adjusting those tools to measure that culture in a culturally fair way. Okay. So so in the last about 50 years, this is where cross-cultural approaches have tried to really understand what is human development from a cultural perspective. And is there universals in development, or are there things that are really based and hindered within culture? Okay. And this is really important, especially when we talk about human development, because I think I mentioned at the beginning of the semesters, human beings are kind of a unique species. We're not the only one, but we're kind of a unique species in that we are one of the very, 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 very few species that are born with physically undeveloped brains. Okay. And kind of to kind of explain this, it actually has to do more with the structure of the female pelvis. Okay. The human brain, in order for us to have a fully developed human brain when we're born, the female pelvis has to almost double in size. Okay. Which, from a biological evolutionary perspective, it really isn't possible. The pelvic area of the female body is about the opening is about as big as it's going to get. Okay. And that's not a hit on females or anything else. That's just the biological, physiological facts of the matter. Okay. And so, in order for human brains to further develop, they have to develop outside of the mother's womb. Okay. And so, and the other part of this is that, and I don't want anyone to go away with this idea. One of the reasons why humans are born with an undeveloped brain is because we don't have the largest brains in the animal kingdom. Okay. The for the rest of the animal kingdom, brain size is related to body size. So things such as so species such as elephants and whales have the largest brains because of their body mass. What is unique to human beings is that we break this brain to body mass equation. Okay. We actually have an oversized brain for our body size. Okay. Specifically in the frontal cortical areas of the brain that give way to problem solving, to consciousness, to the realization of identity and social aspects of life. Okay. And hence that is why we're kind of born physically underdeveloped because we don't we our brain size is doesn't meet that equation that most species do. Okay. So what this means is instead of fully developing brains within the mother's womb, in the biological stuff of and health of mom's stomach, we largely develop in our social cultural domains of the world. Our brains develop within the context of language development, in the context of cognitive development and emotional development. And that's where our brains tend to do most of its growth between about the age of 0 to 6, not coming fully physically developed until around the age, the dependent upon the research you read, anywhere from 21 to about 28. It really just depends on the research you read. Okay. So this is kind of where we feel that culture must then play some important role, especially for human development. Okay. And so when we look at this, we should just note some definition. What is cross-cultural development psychology? We'll just do some really quick definitions here. It's a systematic study of the relationship between cultural context and human development and behaviors that become established in the repertoire of individuals growing in a particular culture. Okay. Another definition is cultural similarities and differences in development processes that are outcomes expressed by behaviors and individuals in a group. Okay. So kind of what we've been talking about, but these are kind of more formal definitions. Okay. So just really quickly, what is the areas that developmental psychologists really focus on? And there's really three domains. And you'll notice that these domains are in a Venn diagram because they can overlap, and they do. But if we start up here with biological processes, this is obviously how we develop physically, not only neurologically, but our body growth, our body changes, and how we grow and develop. Okay. And this is an area where when we talk about certain types of physical development, we can definitely see the influence of place and culture. One area that we really can see this is in puberty. Okay. During puberty, what we're doing is we're developing our secondary sexual traits, so breasts, body hair, all of those types of things, and our body is preparing for sexual reproduction. Okay. Um, and so we're basically going from our child body to our adult body. Okay. And you would probably suspect that this would be a completely biological process about what age a person goes through puberty, when it starts, when it ends, and all of these things. But actually, culture plays a large role on when a person actually goes through puberty. Okay. So some examples is people who were raised in urban cultures go through puberty at a younger age compared to people raised in a rural culture. Okay. Um, Here in the United States, for example, the age at which, and we'll look at young girls right now because the mark of puberty, we can look at the first menstruation, right? Okay. We're finding that here in the United States, girls' menstruation is getting younger and younger and younger. In fact, I think this needs updated because I thought I saw a case study on a girl that was actually younger than this. The youngest girl right now that has gone through puberty in the United States was 4 years old. So, um, I will say when I worked with children who were sexually abused, the youngest pregnant victim that I worked with was 8. So, we're seeing this getting younger and younger here in the United States, and that's regardless of the rural versus urban idea. So even people in rural communities are starting to go through this younger and younger. Okay. And so, and then the other part of it that we'll talk about here in this section is parenting, okay, and cultures around parenting, because we find that, again, using women as the kind of case example, we find that young girls with an emotionally distant mother tend to go through puberty at a younger age. We find that young girls raised with an absent father tend to go through puberty at a younger age. Okay. So parenting dynamics, we find also play a role in the age at which someone goes through a physical transformation. Okay. And this is where the role of things like socio-emotional social processes come into play that influence a biological process. Okay. Now, on that same area, so that's an example of how biological processes can be influenced, for example, by social, emotional, and cultural processes. What about cognition? Okay. Cognition, if we want to think about the word cognitive, cognitive is basically the fancy word for thought. Okay. It's how we think about things, how we interpret things, how we problem solve, how we reflect, all of those things that we do in that mental process and preparing to behave or act in some way. Okay. Um, and what we'll see here in a few minutes, again, is the role of these socio-emotional processes and biological processes. Okay. Because one important aspect of cognition is, of course, language. And as we talked about, I believe last Thursday, is that biologically, regardless of the amount of language is spoken to a child in a given culture, from a biological perspective, children still start to develop language roughly at the same age. So this is where biological processes influence cognitive processes about when language starts to develop, irregardless of a cultural process. Okay. However, depending upon how that language is used, determines how that child will be able to successfully interact in that cultural context. Okay. So that's an example of cognitive processes. And here in a minute, we'll talk about Piaget's cognitive model. I hope if you've taken Psych 101 or human development, you probably remember Piaget, but we'll get to him in a minute. But he talked about basically 4 stages of cognitive development. Okay. And his model has been tested across cultures, which makes us have to rethink his model. It's not that his model is not valid, but the interpretation of each stage getting to a higher level of cognition probably is a little bit far-fetched, which we'll get to in a minute. And then what about socio-emotional processes? We already talked about how they influence cognitive processes, and we talked a little bit about how it results in, for example, language development and those kinds of things. But when we talk about socio-emotional processes, the reason why there isn't 2 other circles that says social and another circle that says emotional is our social world and our emotional world are kind of one and the same. Okay. We talk about private feelings and emotions and things like we do. We try to hide them from our social world. And I get all those. Those are all cultural bound things. But the purpose of an emotion is communication. Okay. We don't become sad just for our own self. we become sad to be it expressed to our social world so that maybe something can change. Okay. So every emotion has a communicative process. Okay. And we will see that the way a culture expresses emotions determines how an individual will grow and develop their emotions. Okay. So we see right now, for example, here in the United States, a cultural shift maybe about men's mental health. Okay. Because in our Western culture, especially, it's not appropriate for men to express emotions. Yes, anger, we can get away with that. Frustration, we could probably get away with that. Emotions of dominance, okay. But things like sadness, things like empathy, things like those type of emotions that are labeled more quote unquote feminine are not widely accepted in the American culture. Okay. And so in this culture, men are taught to push down those emotions and express them through a dominating way. Okay. And so that's an example of how culture plays a role in forming how a person becomes emotionally expressive. Okay. Um, so these are all how examples of how these dynamics work, at least within a cultural context. Okay. We are going to actually come back to these after the break. These are, just so you know, what I'm skipping through are some research methods, but they make a little bit more sense. Some of these, when we're talking more in the cognition areas and the social areas, they'll make a little bit more sense. So we'll kind of skip that. Do know that what we're presenting here is based on some of those research methods, but they'll make a lot more sense within the next series of lectures. So from the studies that have been done, from cultural studies of development, what are some of kind of the common themes? Okay. And one common theme, and we talked about this in that last slide, is that while children tend to develop approximately at the same rate across cultures, the context in which they are raised matters. All right. And again, I'll go back to the example of language. Okay. So a person who is a child, an infant who is exposed to one single language, okay, and one singular sound of a language, okay, around the age of about 36 to 48 months, they will lose the ability to hear sounds that are unique to other languages, okay? So we're biologically born to hear the whole range of sounds within any language. Okay. But we're biologically programmed that by the age of around 36 to 48 months of development, if we're not exposed to unique sounds that are unique to other languages, we don't have the ability to hear those sounds. It's almost like a death sound to our ear. Okay. An example of this is I was very, very much raised in English only speaking home. Didn't I lived in a community that was like 98% white, so there was no Spanish influence. My grandparents encouraged not speaking our immigrant language from Germany, um, and all of those things. It was a very forced English language, and that was it. Okay. Well, fast forward to today, I'm married to a Mexican American woman who a lot of her language speaking with her kids and her family is in Spanish. And there are times that she'll be speaking Spanish, and all of a sudden I will stop hearing different sounds or different things. It's like I feel like she stopped talking when in reality she didn't, because those pauses, what I thought were pauses, were because they were sounds she was giving in the Spanish language that I don't have the ability to hear. Okay. And that is why, and I think this is important to consider when we're looking at, for example, Native American language development and the movement to bring back the language of Native people, is why that language should be focused on children. Okay. Because if many more generations of children are raised without hearing unique sounds within that native language, more and more there's going to be sounds that are forgotten or lost within that native language. So that's why I feel it's important. For example, our language center is in the Head Starts doing immersion training and all those kinds of things for the Tana O'atham language. So something to consider if you are working with your native tribes and language reclamation and all those kinds of things, that we need to remember this unique developmental period. Um, and that we need to be working with our children as young as we can in order to reclaim a lot of languages or sounds will be lost. Okay. Something to consider when we think about those types of things, especially within our native communities where language is dying. So, okay, the other general themes is deals with parents. And the first one, and we'll get through these as we go, is parenting styles. Okay. So, for example, here in the United States, where we feel that there's a family hierarchy system, we tend to use more of authoritarian type of parenting style. This is where the parent sets the rules, and there's consequences for the children breaking the rules. And it's kind of like when a child asks, "Mommy, why do I have to do that?" And mommy says, "Because I said so." That's an authoritarian type of parenting style. Okay, very much tied to the individualistic, you could almost say capitalistic attitudes we have here in the United States about those who are at the top are the ones in charge. Those who are at the bottom just need to listen and obey, kind of ideas that we have about American institutions and systems. Okay. Um, we also see, though, even in some countries where that's collective, where you would say, assume that they're more authoritative parenting styles. So authoritative is that the parent includes the child into decision making, right? And so you would assume that within a collective society where the group is more important than the individual, that you would expect a more authoritative, let's talk this out, let's agree upon what we should do as a community, as a group. And certainly you do get that, for example, in countries like Thailand, Vietnam, um, what are a few of the other ones? Um, Vietnam, Thailand. I'm trying to think of another one. Oh, what is it? I know New Zealand. Okay. However, I'll just go on with that. There's a few others. I just can't think of them. However, in some collective countries, for example, in Japan, they have a very authoritarian parenting style. Okay. Even though they're collective, the parents feel like they are charged to make sure that their children are productive members of society. Okay. So in a lot of Japan parenting style, because of the power distance, the power difference between parent and child, not whether it's collective or individualistic, you see a very authoritarian parenting style that tends to be very strict. Okay. Now those are generalizations. There's always differences within every culture, but that's kind of what we see. Okay. And this goes to that next part, right, to cultural values. What is important to a culture? For example, in Japan, it's obedience. It's about being the best you can be within the area that your society feels you fit into, kind of going to kind of what's called a caste idea, where you develop into the position in life that you belong in. Okay. Um, Again, here in the United States, it tends to be more authoritarian because we believe in the power structures within our culture. Okay. Um, but I will say that because of some of the cultural values here in the United States, dealing with emphasis on children and whatnot, we do have a lot more mixed types of parenting styles. So you'll find authoritative, authoritarian, and even though there's slightly more authoritarian parents in the United States, you do find more diverse parenting styles because of that idea of family and freedom and all those kinds of cultural values that it brings. And then this goes down to what are the parenting goals? What is their goal for their children? Okay. In some cultures, it's pure survival, right? If we think about some quote unquote third world cultures, it's about surviving from day to day. How do I get my child to survive from childhood to adolescence to adulthood? Okay. For some parents, it may be simply getting a child to college, getting them through school. um, what do I hear? Here in the United States, a lot of parenting issues center around what's called first world problems, right? Is it going to be McDonald's or Domino's tonight? Those kind of problems that we tend to face here in this culture versus others, and what is the goal of the parent in those contexts? Okay. And we will also know that their parenting practices, there's some general themes that we do see across cultures as well, as far as how does a parent learn to parent within a cultural context. And we find that children tend to take on the parent-child relationship that they had with their parent. So I know I did this when I was raising my son. I would do something and I would go, "Jeez, I just acted like my dad." And I promised I'd never act that way. I don't know a parent who doesn't have that moment where they go, "Oh my God, I'm my parent." Okay. Now, in some contexts, I know for some people, they definitely don't want to be like their parents and they work hard to change that. But in a general context, children tend to take on their parents' parenting style and parenting ways. Okay. And this goes the same with things like discipline practices. Okay. Now, discipline practices tend to be based not on the parent-child relationship, but what is acceptable within the local culture. Okay. So within certain pockets of community, for example, corporal punishment is is the way of discipline. It's the way of changing your child's behavior. In other cultural contexts, it may be things like what is known as positive parenting, where you take the child through the problem and you relive it and story tell about it and come to a better solution for next time. Okay. Um, and then we know that all of these are based on cultural transmission. So we know here in the United States, there's local communities who think that spanking a child is child abuse, and other communities who think that it's completely and totally appropriate. And I will tell you from a scientific perspective, the scientific evidence is very, very mixed on spanking. Okay. It's not a simple, once upon a time, there was research that came out that said spanking increases the probability that a child will end up in jail or prison in the legal system. That is true. Okay, I'll tell you, when I worked in the prison system, there was never an adult that I worked with that didn't say they weren't spanked. But that's what we call an illusory correlation. Okay, meaning that there's an association, but one didn't cause the other. Okay, and so I would be very careful with the research literature on spanking, as that it can be very deceptive in a lot of ways, but that's because of the complex cultural attitudes and beliefs behind it. Okay. And so that's an example of cultural transmission. Okay. And when we come back after the break, we are going to read a book, and we're going to have, well, we're not going to read the entire book. We're going to read a couple chapters out of it. It's called The Drunken Comportment. Okay. Any of you heard of this book? It is a classic. If you go into sociology, especially within Native American context or within anthropology with Native American emphasis, you'll probably read this book. It's kind of a classic study from anthropologists and sociologists who studied really what they went out to study was substance abuse pre-post colonialism. Okay, so we know that here in the United States, there were certain spirits and alcohols that Native Americans already had developed. Okay, but what was unique to the colonial alcohol was the grain. Okay. We don't have very much evidence here in the Americas that there were grain alcohols that were developed, such as whiskey or rye or gin type of alcohols that were developed, or even beer. Well, there were some types of beers. Take that back. But there wasn't really grain type alcohol. So what they were interested in was the introduction of grain alcohol into Native American communities. And the interesting thing that we'll find, and this is interesting, is that in some cultural contexts, dependent upon the culture, is what the grain alcohol had an effect on. Okay. So, for example, we'll read about one culture that was a very much warring, really kind of bloody culture off of, I think, the Caribbean coast, I think. And after grain alcohol was introduced, they became very docile. They lost their aggressive warring need, basically. However, there was a culture in central Mexico that was very uh, peaceful, I guess is the term to use. They were very peaceful people. They got along with each other. But the introduction of grain alcohol, they became a very aggressive, violent kind of community. Okay. And so we'll see how, again, the interplay of biology, an introduction of a new substance, and how it then can influence social, cultural, and cognitive processes and cultural processes. So it's kind of an interesting thing to kind of see, because what this book really focuses on is that local culture and parenting style and how children were raised within that community. And you'll see the changes dependent upon the introduction of grain alcohol, which is kind of interesting. The other thing that I like about this is it also shows that the bias about the quote unquote drunken Indian and all of those things are not true. Um, there's some societies in this book that just completely rejected the grain alcohol. They couldn't stand it. They thought it was gross. And there were others that were forced to. It was forced upon them. And so this idea that these alcohols were introduced and all of a sudden the Native Americans became drunkards is actually a fairy tale created from colonialism, which is another kind of interesting thing about this book that I think is interesting. Um, so this is something we'll read. We'll read a couple chapters out of it when we return and have a little assignment associated with it. So. All right. So, as I mentioned, probably one of the most researched models of cognitive development is Jean Piaget's model. Okay. And I'm not going to kind of give the full kind of blown lecture on this because I'm thinking maybe you did introduction to psychology or something where this was gone through in a lot more depth. But what Piaget theorized is that we develop in stages, that during certain age periods, we're kind of pre-programmed to start to master or some more complex cognitive task. Okay. And so just to kind of rehearse some of his stages, and in each one of these stages, there's a task that a child must complete in order to show that they're going on to the next stage of development. The first one is the sensory motor period. Okay. What Piaget felt was occurring between about the age of 0 to 24 months is the child was learning about themselves in time and space. They were learning how to reach out and grab a bottle and put the bottle in their mouth and learn how to eat and interact with objects and really try to just start that interaction with life, okay, and understanding the world around them. And during this, the child would start to learn things like adaptation. So knowing the difference between a bottle versus a cup, okay, and those types of differentiations, and learning the difference between, for example, a dog and a cat, because of maybe the way they respond when you interact with them, okay. Around 24 months of age, Piaget, in his time and the research tools he had at the time, learned that around 24 months of age, children develop something called object permanence. Okay. What object permanence is the ability to realize that objects exist, even if they're not within your sensory detection. Okay. And so one of the ways Piaget would do this is he would have this, use your imagination. He would have this little wall. And on one side, he had the little child, and on the other side would be Piaget or the child's mom. Okay. And what Piaget would do is he would set the little baby's toy right in front of the baby. The baby would recognize it. And then in front of the baby, he would put the teddy bear, or let's say it's a teddy bear, behind the little wall. And he would go kind of do this expression, where did the teddy bear go, right? And it wasn't until about, and most babies would kind of go, they would just start playing with something else, or they would go do something else. It wasn't until 24 months of age, to kind of make fun of Piaget, that the little kid would go, "You idiot, you just set it behind there. Here, let me get it for you." All right. And the kid would recognize that even though he couldn't sense the teddy bear anymore, the teddy bear existed. Okay. Now, we can fast forward from Piaget's time. We know that children start to develop object permanence around 6 months to 12 months of age. And so it's a little younger than what Piaget originally theorized. But again, that is also culturally based, that we'll see. But, anyways, so what does being able to hold objects in your mind mean? It means that you can mentally represent it, okay? That you have some mental representation of that object so that you could remember it. And this is where Piaget believed the child goes into what's called the pre-operational stage, meaning that the child is able to symbolize thought, but they're unable to do some things such as object manipulation as far as what's called irreversibility. Okay. Irreversibility is, for example, if you take a little toy truck and you take it apart, not realizing or not having the ability to realize that you could put the little truck back together. Okay. And again, in Piaget's time, it wasn't until around about the age of 6 or 7 where children came to the realization that if I took the truck apart, I could put the little truck back together. Okay. And this is what's called irreversibility, meaning the child is able to symbolize an object, but they're not able to mentally manipulate the object. Okay. Plus, we have things like centrism and egocentrism, the child feeling that the world is all about them and whatnot, not realizing uh, uh, that the world evolves everyone kind of thing. But what is, and so is there evidence of this symbolization? There certainly is. The average, again, we're talking about weird societies, okay? The average child in a weird society will learn anywhere between 30,000 to 60,000 words between the age of birth to the age of 6 years old. I don't know if you remember remembering that many words. I certainly do not, because what happens after the age of 6 is we're going to go through these other operational phases where we start combining things. We stop using words that we don't use very often anymore. And so we go from about 30 to 60,000 words. I think I'm down to about 500 now. Somewhere around there, I think is my limitation. Um, but so we kind of start weaning them off after the age of 6. But this focuses on this idea of symbolization. Okay. In the concrete operational phase that happens around about the age of 6 and 7, children are able to do some unique things. Okay. The first one is the notion of conservation. Okay. The most basic example I'll do for this class is if you have use your imaginations, two equal size balls of Play-Doh. Okay. And then you take one of the pieces and you ask the child, are these the same size? Okay. And even child under the age of about 7 will say, yes, they're the same size. Okay. And then Piaget in front of the child would maybe smash the second one. So he would smash this one. And so it was maybe a more flatter shape like this. And then Piaget would ask, are they still the same size? Is it still the same amount? Okay. And what he found is most children under the age of 7 would say, no, there's more or less in one or the other. They didn't realize that volume doesn't change because you change the shape, that they're using their visual cues to determine whether one is more or less. Okay. And so they start to develop this idea of conservation that mass doesn't change even though the shape changes. Okay. The other thing they are able to do is what's called mental rotation. Okay. So this is where Piaget would have a child at a table and he would use what's called the three mountain task, where he would have one kind of triangle here. Let's just use triangles instead of trying to explain this in mountain. And then in one side, maybe you would have a tall, skinny triangle. And then on the other side, maybe a shorter, wider triangle. Okay, that's a weird picture. All right, so, and let's say this one's red, and we'll color this one green. Okay. Yeah. And again, Piaget would be on one side of the table, or mom would be on the other side of the table, and the child would be on the other side. And Piaget would ask the child, what do you see? And if you would guess, the child would say, well, I see this red, tall triangle. I see this bigger triangle, and then I see a shorter green triangle on the other side. Okay. And then Piaget would ask, well, what does Piaget see? What does mom see? And under the age of 7, children would report the same thing. Well, duh, mom sees this tall red triangle, this larger triangle, and then this shorter green triangle. Okay. After the age of 7, children actually started to report correctly what mom saw, or Piaget saw. They would correctly go, well, mom would see the short green triangle and then the big triangle, and then she'd see this tall red triangle. Okay. And the child wasn't able to do that until about the age of 7. Now, what does that represent? It represents mental manipulation, because what does that task require? It requires the child to put that image in their head and mentally rotate the table around to realize what mom's perspective was. Okay. So this is where Piaget felt that children were able to mentally manipulate their world. And this is where we went into the concrete operational phase. Okay. In the concrete operational phase is where we get, as it suggests, concrete thinking. Okay. Black and white thinking. So there's good guys, bad guys. There's black, there's white. There's cars, there's trucks. Okay. Everything is in very clear, delineated categories. Okay. And and this categorization is important because if you think about all of the symbols that the child is holding in their head, that becomes cognitively overwhelming. So we naturally start to mentally categorize things in order to deal with the mass amount of information that we're now holding in our head. Okay. And then I'll just rehearse this. Formal operations, usually done with a paper pencil test, is when we're able to think in the abstract, in the ideas, logics, and systems of thinking. It is when we realize that a cop who represents good can do bad things. A person sitting in prison also has good qualities and good attributions. It's being able to see that the world is more gray than black and white. Okay. And so it's that ability to see things in the abstract or in the more complex. Okay. So as I mentioned, to kind of wrap this up, this was tested in several societies, Piaget's theory. And what he found is it was really dependent upon the culture that the person was in that determined which stage the person would obtain or probabilistic would go into. Okay. So for example, here in the United States, which we'll represent with a U, about 85% of Americans, adults, are in stage 3 of Piaget's developmental stage. Only about 15 are in the formal operations phase or in one of these two lower stages of development. In Germany, which we'll represent with a G, about 90% of Germans who've been tested are in the formal operations phase, meaning they think more abstractly. Okay. However, when we've tested this in the Amazon, which we'll represent with the A, greater than 60%, or about around 60%, only go to about stage 2 of development. And the question then becomes from a weird perspective. So does that make Germans more superior than Americans, which makes them more superior than the Amazon? And according to cross-cultural research, absolutely not. Okay. And let me kind of explain this in this context. If you think about the American culture, what is it that is required to survive in it? And we probably all heard this before. We're a land of laws and rules. What you need to do in order to survive in the United States is to learn what to do and what not to do. And that pretty much will set you up to survive in the American culture. Okay. In the German culture, because of the complexity of Germany, if we look at through the 19th century, what they went through in both World War I, World War II, if we think about they are the basis of things like universities and those things. That's where most universities started from and developed from. The basis of science, as I think I mentioned in here, the first psychological lab was in Germany. Okay. They tend to think of things in a more abstract way. Okay. And even their legal system has a lot more flexibility to determine whether a person should be legally liable or not. Okay. And that's necessary then to survive within that German culture right now. Okay. Now, if you think about these individuals in the Amazon, and we'll end with this today, if you think about the people in Amazon, what is required to survive there? Well, it requires you to know what paths to take. It requires you to know the subtle differences between an edible leaf and a leaf that will kill you, and edible animals and I mean, you're really required to symbolize a lot of things and be able to notice very subtle differences, meaning there's not much room for categorization within the complexity of being able to know the difference between subtle leaf shapes, for example, or subtle berry differences. Okay. It's really a life or death situation in order to know the land that well, in order to survive there. Okay. So this is a necessary thing that their environment says you need to be able to do. And if you think about it, if you take someone from the United States or from Germany and you have them go explore Amazon, can we do it like a person who is native there in Amazon? No, we have to bring our navigation tools. We would need to bring our tents and our tools. We'd have to bring the food because we wouldn't know what to eat. We'd have to bring our machinery in order to make it through the jungle. And we would probably hire a local guide. Okay. So, so this idea that because these individuals are in the concrete and formal operation phase, could they survive in the stage 2 of Amazon? No. These people have a much more complex understanding of their culture than we do. Okay. And so this is the idea, is that each of these stages, one's not superior to the other. It is all based upon what that culture and what that environment demands on the person to survive within that cultural and environmental context. Okay. So we're going to stop right there for now.